I love that question. I think it's a question that we all, a lot of times ask ourselves for anything is, hey, what is in it for me? And even specifically for faith. And I think one person here specifically has actually wrestled with that question some more. And tonight we get the opportunity to hear from her. And so y'all go ahead and make some noise for Sophie Craig as she comes up and shares more of her story.
So as they said, my name is Sophie, but in my senior year of high school, my teacher asked our class to create a presentation saying where we're going to college and what we wanted to do once we got there. And so I knew at the time that I wanted to go to K-State, and I put two things in my presentation. One was that I wanted to get involved in a student ministry, and the second was that I wanted to go swing dancing. And so clearly I didn't know a lot about what college had to offer at the time, but those two things actually really well illustrate where my head was at when I was going into college. The first being that I knew I wanted God to still be a part of it because for the past 18 years, I had attended church regularly and even gone to a Christian school, and so faith being scheduled into my day was all that I had ever known. And the second was that I really wanted to just enjoy college and have like a full experience. I don't know why I thought swing dancing was the key to that, but I also thought other things would be involved, like getting involved on campus, joining a sorority, and really just making friends all throughout that process. And so amidst all that, there was one friend who I became close with, and her name was Molly. And Molly did things that was out of the ordinary in a really positive way. And a good example of that is one time we went to play sand volleyball at the rec, and we're having a great time playing sand volleyball with friends. And I look up at one point, and Molly isn't even playing. She's actually talking to a stranger off on the side. And because of what I had known of Molly up until that point and known about her life, I knew that she was sharing her faith with them. And I just remember thinking that that was really courageous of her, but also really appreciating that she believed and also did what she said she believed. And so I thought it was cool because I could see that Molly gave God her entire life. And I realized that I was giving God a part of my life, but at the time I didn't want to give that up because I knew I'd have to give up pieces that went against what the Bible said, and I just wasn't willing to do it. And so I spent the rest of freshman year kind of straddling this line of making sure that faith looked like it was a part of my life, but also making sure I didn't miss out on anything I wanted to do. And then sophomore year rolled around, and I got to this point where it was like a crossroad, and I could literally see like two futures in front of me. And the first was where I continued to just give God a part of my life, but on my terms. And the second was where I actually gave him complete control. And I'd seen what that looked like in Molly's life, and I knew that there was a joy and contentment that I wanted. And so then winter break came, and I came across this verse, and it's Philippians 3, 7 through 8. And it says, "But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord." And that's when I actually decided that everything that I had been clinging to apart from God just wasn't worth it to me anymore. And that I would rather have Christ instead of everything that I'd had instead of him. And so even though I had attended a Christian school for my entire life and had a strong background of knowing who God was, that was the moment that I actually made Jesus Lord of my life. And I went back to school spring semester current year. And I honestly was really nervous because I was like, what if the things I'm giving up is too big of a price to pay? And I remember thinking like, okay, God, I'll trust that you're worth more, but I honestly haven't seen it yet. And it was really cool because God showed up and showed me that he is so incredibly faithful. And in comparison to what I felt like I was losing, I really was gaining so much more. An example of this is that instead of having to find my identity inside of leadership positions that were going to end in a year or clubs that were going to end after college, I found my identity in God, who promises that he has an unwavering love for me and that he will always be faithful to me. And instead of being ruled by the stress of class and having tests roll around every 3 weeks that kind of just wrecked my anxiety, I got to just trust that God was going to take care of it. A good example is a couple weeks ago, I had 3 tests in 1 week, typical. But when I felt the stress creeping in, I was able to pray that I could hand that anxiety over to God and just rest in the peace knowing that he's big enough to handle my 2 credit hour class. And then one thing, too, that was probably the greatest part of accepting Christ that I couldn't have predicted before was just realizing that knowing God personally is the best part, and that it's so much better than having him be this high, distant God that I really can't relate to at all. And it's really crazy because, honestly, I was really close to choosing that second future where I only gave God a part of my life. And I just can't imagine that being the case now because having known what it's like to experience what it's like to know God is so much better. And I can say that I would not trade it for anything. Thanks, guys. I'll welcome back up Sims.
Man, that was all. That's so cool, Sophie. I think it's crazy, man. And there's really, when we turn to Christ, there's a lot in it for us. I think the ability to trust God, especially with the busy school schedule, man, just a really huge benefit. And so thanks so much for sharing your story. It was cool to see, man, just how you've wrestled through that question and seen some really cool things come out of it. But hey, tonight, like we mentioned earlier, we've got an opportunity to hear from Joel Johnson. And Joel's going to talk more about his family here in a little bit. But if you don't know Joel, Joel and his wife have actually spent over 20 years, has a lot of experience investing in college students and investing and helping them grow in their faith. So it's a cool opportunity, cool privilege for us to get to hear from him tonight and even get to learn from him. And so I'm excited for it. I hope you guys are as well. And so let's all get excited as Joel Johnson comes up and gives his talk.
Hey, what's happening, K-State? How's it going tonight? You all survived midterms in the first half of the semester so far. You're into the second half. It's downhill from there, Mr. Bailey. It gets easier, doesn't it? Maybe not. Hey, I am excited to be with you all here tonight in Manhattan. I'm from Manhattan, as Jacob said. I've lived here for 21 years. I've been gone all week, but it's cool to be home, right? Isn't that what Dorothy said? There's no place like home. Well, it is. It's fun to be here. It's fun just to actually get to speak tonight, even on this series and kind of closing it up that you all have been looking at for the past several weeks. You've been kind of talking about this idea of asking questions, thinking about some of the big questions as it relates to God, as it relates to faith, and trying to see what exactly does the Bible have to say about those questions. So tonight we're going to continue that. Again, we're going to kind of wrap it up. But as we begin, before we look at a particular question, I actually want to look at a picture. And so here's what we're going to do. I want you just to take 30 seconds, and with someone around you, just kind of imagine yourself in this picture. Okay, as the weather starts to cool off, that's probably a fun thing, right? Imagine yourself in this picture and just talk with someone beside you for 30 seconds. What's going through your mind? Okay, envision yourself in this picture. What's going through your mind? Take 30 seconds. Do that with someone right now. Okay, let's pull it all back together. Now, I want to hear a handful of the things that were going through your mind. Just shout them out. You're in this picture. You're checking this out. What are you thinking? What do you see here?
How did they build it?
How did they build it? Meaning what? The road? Yeah, how do you build that? I'm sure we have some civil engineers in the room that can probably explain it a little bit to us. What else? It's peaceful. You're thinking how peaceful it is. What else? Jumping into the water, like you're wanting to jump in the water, or you want to make sure you don't, like, okay, you want to. Yeah, it definitely looks refreshing, doesn't it? What else? Summer. Already starting to think for the summer. Yeah, it's just around the corner. 8 months to go. It'll be here before we know it. Another thought or two? You got to shout it out. It is a sharp curve. Yeah, don't go too fast around that curve. Final thought? Someone got a final thought? What's happening here in this picture? Okay, you're curving in to a city using your imagination. Yeah. Well, when I think of this picture, I do kind of think of it in some ways as kind of a metaphor for life, right? Or I kind of picture that road being kind of the road of life that we're all on, and I'm envisioning myself on that road, okay? And on that road, there's some excitement. I'm enjoying the ride. You know, I'm trying to make the most of it. There's also a little bit of risk, you know, because there's no rail on that road. You want to be careful. You know, you don't want to do anything too foolish. But one of the things I'm also doing, if I'm in this picture, is I'm anticipating. I'm kind of curious, you know, and in some ways I'm asking the question, hey, what's around the corner? You know, what is around that sharp curve that we see there? And not only am I asking, hey, what's around the corner, but when I think about life and I think about, hey, what's in my future, what's around the corner of my future, I'm also asking this question, not just what the details are, but I'm asking, hey, what's in it for me? As I think about my life and when I turn the corner, when I get out of college, when I enter into that next phase of life, my job, my family, all of those things, hey, what's going to happen, but more importantly, what's in it for me? Am I going to be excited? And am I going to enjoy? Am I going to make the most of whatever it is that's around that corner in my future? And so this is the question for tonight. It is, hey, what's in it for me? What is it around the corner in life, particularly as I think about my relationship with God? if I really get serious about my relationship with God, if I begin to experience what it means to know Him, to follow Him, if I begin to really grow in my faith, then what is that going to mean for what's around the corner? How's that going to affect my life 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And ultimately, what's in it for me? Now, I hear this question a lot around my house. Here's a picture of my wife, my family. Jennifer and I, we will have been married 18 years here in just 3 weeks. And I've been privileged to have her as my wife, to get to do life together. And one of the greatest privileges that we have as a couple are our 2 girls. I've got a daughter named Ellie, who's 11, and Alexa, who is 9 years old. That's actually on campus with them climbing that tree, if you're familiar. I can't remember what building that's in front of. I think it's like the chemistry building or something like that. But I love being their dad. But you know, being their dad, I hear the question, hey, what's in it for me a lot? I mean, if I just think about even over the past few days, okay, we had a time, a lot of times over the weekends, we'll have like a morning of chores. Okay, so we'll do some chores. Some of those will be inside chores, some of those will be outside chores, and it never fails. When we talk to our girls about the chores we're going to do, instantly they're saying, hey, Dad, well what am I going to get? You know, if I do the chores, you know, Ellie, she's starting to mow my yard, okay? And she's like, Dad, if I mow, do I get $1? And I'm like, yeah, you'll get $1. $1. She's a bargain, you know, $1, get the yard mowed, you know, but she's asking, hey, what's in it for me? If I do these chores, what's in it for me? Or it's like, hey, if we do these chores, do we get a movie night tonight? You know, again, asking the question, what's in it for me? Or other scenarios. Just the last couple of days, I was saying, hey, girls, y'all want to run an errand with me? Let's go run some errands, do this, do that. Instantly out of their mouth, well, Dad, do we get to go to Sonic? Dad, can we stop and get ice cream? You know, and so instantly there's this question, hey, I'll do those chores, I'll run those errands, we'll do this, we'll do that, but Dad, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? It's natural for us to ask that question. That's not a bad question to ask. It's just a natural question to ask. My girls ask it, I ask it as I think about different stages of life and different opportunities that I have. But I think sometimes, and in a lot of ways, when we think about our relationship with God, when we think about spiritual growth, it's the same question that we're asking. Hey, if I really follow God, what's in it for me? And I think what we'll be surprised to find is the Bible actually has to say a lot about it. The Bible actually teaches us a lot about what's in it for us. What's going to be around the corner if I really begin to take my faith seriously and grow in my faith today? How's it going to affect me tomorrow? Let me give you a couple of examples. These are some of the most common verses in the Bible. These are some of the verses that people put like up on their Instagram, okay? And the reason why we like these type verses is because they tell us, hey, what's in it for me? And so we love places in the Bible where we kind of learn what's in it for me when it comes to our faith. So take this one, Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Have y'all heard that one before? Again, we love that verse. It tells us what's in it for me. Or John 10:10. The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. But I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. Jesus is talking there, and he's trying to teach us, hey, what's in it for you? Why is this worth following me? Okay, so these are kind of some big picture type statements. What's in it for me? But how does that practically play out? What are some of the benefits that is going to be true of this future life, of this abundant life, of this full life that God promises? Well, that's what we want to look at for a few minutes tonight. But before we can kind of look at some of the practicals of what's in it for you and what's in it for me when we think about growing in our faith, I want to kind of give a couple of big picture kind of realities, a couple things to keep in mind even as we answer the question for tonight. And so here's 2 things to keep in mind before we can kind of get into what's in it for me. And here's the first one. How many of y'all have heard of this book, The Purpose-Driven Life? Okay, a few of y'all have. Probably your parents have. This came out about 20 years ago, and it became an instant bestseller. Okay, for 90 weeks in a row, this book was at the top of the New York Times best-selling list. For 90 weeks in a row. Over the last 30 years, only behind the Harry Potter series, this book has sold more copies here in the U.S. than any other book over the past 30 years, except for the Harry Potter series. So you got all of them, and then you got this one, kind of next in line. Okay, so it was a really popular book over the past 20, 30 years. If you were to take this book and you were to open it up to the very first chapter, the very first page, and you were to read the very first sentence, this is how this book, again, the most sold, other than Harry Potter book over the last 30 years, this is the first sentence in that book. It starts out with these words. it's not about me. Life's not about me. Now, I mentioned that, and that's the first thing I want us to keep in mind, because all of tonight, we're asking the question, what's in it for me? And we're going to see the Bible has a lot to say. There is a lot in it for me, but we can't talk about those things without considering this reality. And the reality is this, it's not ultimately about me. Life's not ultimately about me. The Bible is not ultimately about me. You and I are not the central figure in the Bible. We're not the central figure in life. Ultimately, it's about God. Okay? But we tend to default to thinking it's all about me. It doesn't mean we're not the beneficiaries, but we have to keep in mind that it's not about me. Some of you all that are maybe familiar with astronomy may recognize the name Ptolemy. Okay, Ptolemy was an early astronomer about 2,000 years ago, and he was the first one that kind of convinced basically the known world of a geocentric model of the solar system. And what that means is that he proposed the idea, and for about 1,500 years it was just assumed that the Earth was actually the center of the solar system. All the other planets, the sun itself, all the moons, all revolved around the Earth. It was a geocentric model of the solar system. The Earth is the center of our solar system. It's the center of the universe, and everything revolves around it. Now, about 1500, there was a guy, another astronomer, he was a Polish astronomer, named Nicholas Copernicus. Okay, and Copernicus was actually the first one that proved convincingly that actually that was wrong, that the Earth is not the center of the solar system. You know, actually it was the sun that was the center of the solar system. And the Earth, just like all the other planets, actually revolves around the sun. Now, at the time, this was revolutionary. And Copernicus was actually vilified for it, you know, because there was so much pushback. It's like, hey, how can you believe that? Of course the Earth is the center of all the universe. And he said, actually, no. The Earth's not central. In our solar system, it's the sun. And the Earth actually revolves around it. Now, because this was such a revolutionary idea, it became known as the Copernican Revolution. The idea that the Earth's not the center, but actually the sun is. And I would say in a similar way for us, there's kind of a Copernican revolution that we all have to come to grips with. Okay? That we all have to ultimately embrace, and that is, hey, I am not the center of the universe. Ultimately, life is not about me. We default to that, we assume that, we live that way. But when we open up the pages of the Bible and we really begin to view life rightly, we realize, no, God, you're the center, and I am simply intended to revolve around you. He's the center, not us. It's not ultimately about us. But that doesn't mean that we're not the beneficiaries. In the same way that the world actually benefits, our earth benefits from revolving around the sun. So keep in mind, as we think about what's in it for me tonight, keep in mind that ultimately it's not about me. Second thing I want us to consider as well, kind of on the front end, is this. Not only is it not about me, but God affects everything. God affects everything. When you think about our life, and this is what Sophie referred to earlier, we kind of think of our life through the lens of various compartments. Okay, we have these like a pie chart approach to life. You know, there's kind of my social life, there's kind of my academic life, there's my family, there's my career, there's my money, there's athletics, there's my ambitions, there's my boyfriend, there's my girlfriend, there's my dreams, there's my goals, and we kind of view life as all of these little compartments. And a lot of times when we think about getting to know God or growing in our faith, we simply think, well, God should be a piece. Okay, God should be a part of my life. And then we tend to think, if we operate this way, that growing in our faith simply means that God has to become an increasing part of our life. That growing in our faith just means that the piece of the pie just gets a little bit bigger. God becomes more, and everything else subsequently becomes less. And if this is our paradigm of faith, if this is our paradigm of growing in our faith, then the epitome or kind of the pinnacle of faith is this. It's the point where that God piece of the pie ultimately gets so big that it just squeezes everything else out. And in that model or through that lens of thinking, that means again, kind of the pinnacle of spirituality is to squeeze every part of life out except for God and to basically become like a monk or like a nun or something like that. Okay? But when we actually turn to the Bible, what we realize is this is not the picture of the kind of relationship that God wants to have with us. God never intends to just be a slice of the pie. He never intends to just simply be a section of our life. But the picture that the Bible paints, contrary to that model or that paradigm, is rather God desires to be the center of our life. Okay? God wants to not just be a section of your life, but God wants to be so central in your heart and in your life that He really begins to affect everything. And so if we go back to our question tonight, what's in it for me? We need to realize that our relationship with God, it affects all areas of life. It permeates every area of life. It's not that it's just going to affect us in a few ways. It's going to affect us in every way. It'll benefit us in every way when we actually begin to experience God as He intends to be experienced. And so keep these in mind. I'm going to share with us a few things. What's in it for us? Again, there's an infinite number of them. I'm just going to focus on a handful. But let's keep in mind that, number one, it's not about me. And two, ultimately growing in our faith, it changes everything. It affects everything. It changes our outlook on every part of our lives, not just one part. Here's a verse we're going to kind of frame our the content we're thinking through tonight. It comes from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs was written about 3,000 years ago by a guy named Solomon, who was kind of widely assumed to be the wisest person that has ever lived. He wrote a lot, particularly in the book of Proverbs. We see this, some of his writings. And I want us to kind of check out what he writes here in Proverbs 24. He says this, the first line, he says, Eat honey, my son, for it is good. Honey from the comb is sweet to your taste. Now, this just is a straight-up statement, okay? Keep in mind, back then, there was no such thing as sugar, okay? There was nothing sweet, okay? You couldn't just go down to Cold Stone, and get some ice cream at any point. And so the whole notion of something sweet, unless you were really, really, really rich or really, really, really lucky to find a beehive in your backyard, you had never tasted sweetness before. And here he says, hey, if you ever have the chance to get a hold of some honey, go for it. Taste it. Enjoy it. It will be sweet to your taste. Okay? Now, he's about ready to make kind of a parallel statement, but he wants us to, he's trying to impress us with a point, and that is if you get the chance to eat something sweet, you go for it. The next thing that he says this, wisdom, just like honey is sweet to your taste, if you can get wisdom, it'll be sweet to your soul. In other words, if you get a chance to eat some honey, go after it. Do whatever it takes to get it. And now he's saying the same thing. If you ever get a chance to experience wisdom, then you do whatever it takes to get it. Now, what he means here by wisdom, the Hebrew idea of wisdom that he's writing about, refers to a right way of living that flows from a right relationship with God. So what Solomon is saying here, he says this, if you have a chance to have a right relationship with God and then live the way that God intends for you to live, the way that God created for you to live, then you do anything to get it. You do anything to go after it, just like you would do anything to actually taste honey if you've never tasted anything sweet before. If you get a chance to have this relationship with God and live out of it, you go after it. It's going to be sweet, not just to your mouth, it's going to be sweet to your soul. And then he kind of ends with this. If you find it, there's a future hope for you. And that hope will not be cut off. In other words, this will be worth it. Having a right relationship with God and living out of that relationship with God, if that is what you get to experience, whatever is around the corner, whatever that future hope is, you want it, and you will never regret it. It'll play out in an infinite number of ways, but let me just kind of give you 5 tonight. 5 ways that this relationship with God is worth giving your all for. Whatever God has for you in your life around the corner, whatever is in it for you, it's worth it, and you don't want to miss out on it. Again, there's a ton of things we could talk about, but let me just kind of give you 5 tonight. The first is this. The first thing that's in it for you to take your faith seriously and grow in your relationship with God is God will reshape your character. He'll reshape your character. From the very beginning of the Bible, it teaches us that God created us in His image. God created all of us to image Him, to reflect Him. Okay, we were intended to kind of reflect all the goodness and all the character of God. But the Bible teaches us that sin entered the world. And that image that God intended for us to have, the character that He intended for us to have, got shattered. It got completely crushed. So that now we don't naturally reflect the character and the goodness of God. But what God promises us when we begin to follow Him, one of the things that happens in our future, one of the things that's in it for us, is God begins to put the broken pieces back together. God begins to renew and reshape our character. He's making us back into the kind of man or back into the kind of woman that He always intended for us to be. And so the way this plays out is this. When I think about men and women over the years who have grown in their faith, who have really begun to mature in their faith, what I see changing are things like this. Instead of being a person that's really self-centered, they become men and women who really care for others. Instead of being prone to being judgmental and looking down on other people, they grow to become men and women of compassion, tenderhearted, and gentle towards others, particularly towards others in need. Instead of being people who are arrogant, they become men and women who are humble. Instead of being people who are always anxious and overwhelmed by the circumstances of life, they become men and women who are characterized by peace and by trust. They become men and women of integrity. They become men and women of joy. They become men and women of contentment. Instead of constantly being insecure about what do other people think about me, how do other people view me, what's my reputation, instead there becomes kind of a humble confidence that just results from a life that's secure. Because you know who you are, you know who God's made you, and you ultimately are content with the fact that your life is pleasing to Him. And you don't worry about what other people think of you. You see, those are just a few of the ways that God begins to reshape our character. As we follow Him, part of what's around the corner is, again, you become a person of selflessness. You become a person of humility, a person of confidence, a person of joy, a person of contentment, a person of integrity, a person who's secure, and a person whose life is characterized by peace. Okay? That is part of what is in it for you. That's part of what God has for you as you go around the corner with Him. Second thing that's in it for us, second benefit that we have as we get to know God and grow in a relationship with Him, is it not only reshapes our character, but it reorients our relationships. It reorients our relationships. A guy once came to Jesus one time and he said, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? Of all the commandments, what's the most important? And Jesus said, I can't give you one, I've got to give you two, because they go together. And Jesus answered him, he said this, he said, the greatest commandment is that you love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is this, that you love your neighbor as yourself. You see, what Jesus is saying there is you can't separate your relationship with God from your social life. You can't separate your relationship with God from your relationship with other people. They go hand in hand. And as one grows, as your relationship with God grows, it affects and changes how you interact with people. It affects all of the relationships that you have. And this is another thing that I've seen in men and women over the years as they grow in their faith. It doesn't just change the way they view God or make them religious. All of a sudden, all their relationships are reoriented. All of a sudden, the way that they treat their friends, instead of being, hey, what do I get out of this friendship? It's more about, hey, how can I be a good friend to this person? It changes the way that they relate with their roommates. You know, it makes men and women better roommates. It makes them better fraternity brothers and sorority sisters. It makes you a better sibling to your brother, to your sister. It makes you a different kind of son or daughter. Instead of always complaining and being frustrated by your parents, you begin to appreciate the sacrifices that they make for you. It changes the husband, guys, that you're going to become. Because it's going to change the way you view your wife and your desire to love her in the way that God calls you to. Ladies, it'll change the way that you relate to and respect and honor your husband over the course of the rest of your life. It changes the dad that you're going to be, fellas, and it changes the mom that you're going to be, ladies. You see, our relationship with God, it reorients all of our relationships. It changes the leader that you're going to become. It changes the employee that you're going to be. It's going to change the kind of boss you're going to be someday because they begin to take on the heart of God and the character of God. And it makes you a better person, not just in some moral sense or not in just some religious sense, but your relationship with God begins to affect every relationship that you have and all the people that you do life with. And it makes every one of those relationships better and in the way that God intended for them to be. So what's in it for you? It'll reshape your character. It'll reorient your relationships. Thirdly, God will protect you from pain, and He'll give you perspective through pain. He'll both protect you from pain, but He'll give you perspective through pain. This is something that you all already know. But in this life, guess what? There's going to be a lot of pain. There is no way to live without experiencing significant pain in life. Some of you all have experienced significant pain already, but I promise you, for all of you, into the future, you're going to have more pain. There's going to be some really difficult times. For a lot of you, some of the most difficult days are not in the rearview mirror. They're kind of out the windshield, okay? They're ahead of you. But one of the cool things that God says is, hey, if you trust me, if you follow me, if you grow in your relationship with me, here's what's around the corner. I'll both protect you from pain and I'll give you perspective through it. He never promises that he'll alleviate all pain, but he says, I'll both protect you from it and I'll give you a perspective through it. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I've found that there's kind of two general types of pain that we experience in life. The first kind of pain is basically pain that we bring upon ourselves. Okay? There's certain choices that we make and we experience the consequences. It's kind of like the old adage, we kind of reap what we sow, right? So there's a lot of pain that we bring upon ourselves. And that kind of results in regret and remorse, wishing we could go back, wishing we wouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. There's a lot of pain that we bring upon ourselves. The Bible says the wages of sin is death. We earn some of the consequences because of some of the choices we make. Well, in that sense, God protects us from that kind of pain. Because as we grow in our relationship with Him, God teaches us how to live in a way that doesn't bring that pain and that regret and that shame into our lives. So the more we grow in our faith, it prevents some of the pain that we would otherwise experience because of our poor choices. God desires to protect you. He's like a loving parent that says, yes, I don't want you to make mistakes that will ultimately destroy our lives. But there's a second kind of pain that we experience in this world, and that's just pain because we live in a broken world. Okay, that's things like cancer, that some of you are going to get down the road, or some of your parents or some of your grandparents are getting right now. That's like divorce, that some of you all have experienced between your mom and your dad. It wasn't anything you did, but you got to experience the pain from it. For some of you, it might be miscarriages, like the two that my wife and I have had, or a variety of other different kinds of pain that you're going to experience in this life. And to that kind of pain, it's not necessarily the product of your own choices, it's just the reality of living in a broken world. That kind of pain, God may not protect you from, but what you'll find is He will give you perspective through. He'll help you to see how He wants to use even that kind of pain for your good. How He's going to use it to make you into the kind of man or woman that He's called you to be. When you follow God, it won't eliminate all pain. It will protect you from some, but it'll also give you perspective. And it'll help you to cling to God and experience Him through some of the other. Fourthly, what's in it for us? Not only will it reshape our character, reorient our relationships, protect us from pain, give us perspective through pain, but fourthly, what's in it for us is when we follow God, He connects our lives to a bigger purpose. He connects our lives to a bigger purpose. We realize that God is doing something in our world, that God is doing something to renew and restore and redeem our world, and He actually invites us to be a part. He invites us to play a role. He invites us to give our lives to something that's significant and something that'll last. There's a point in the Bible where Jesus walks up to a couple of guys who are fishing, and He makes a simple statement to them. He says, guys, come follow me, and I'm going to make you fishers of men. You know what He's saying there is, guys, you're just giving your life to putting food on the table. And that's not bad. That's a noble thing. That's a great thing. But He says, guys, in addition to that, I've got a purpose that's even bigger. Come with me and let's fish for men. He kind of uses the metaphor of where they're at right there. And He says, hey, it's a good thing to put food on the table for your family. But there's even a bigger purpose that I want you to be a part of as well. And that's about helping accomplish God's plan and God's purpose in the world. And that's part of what's around the corner for you and I. That's part of what God has in store for you. That's part of what's in it for us. God connects our lives to a bigger purpose. And then the fifth thing and the last thing that we'll kind of close with tonight. What's in it for me? What's around the corner? Not only will God reshape our character, reorient our relationships, protect us from pain, give perspective through pain, and connect our lives to a bigger purpose, but God will also instill hope for what's to come. God will instill hope for what's to come. When we hear the word hope, we tend to think of that as kind of an optimistic wish. Like we hope the Chiefs will win tonight. Or Garrett hopes the Broncos will come back. Or we hope K-State will beat TCU this week, or we hope we'll beat OU for homecoming next week. It's a wish that we have. We're optimistic. We want to believe the best, but we don't exactly know. We can't guarantee that any of those things are going to happen. But when the Bible talks about hope, It's not an optimistic wish. When the Bible uses the word hope, it means a conclusive and a foregone conclusion. It's a reality that's going to happen. It is a confident expectation of what's to come. It is knowing that something good is guaranteed around the corner. And the Bible teaches us that when we put God in the driver's seat of our life, when Christ is our King and our best friend, and we're doing life with Him, He promises us. It's not just wishful thinking. It's not just an optimistic anticipation that maybe something good is around the corner. God instills a hope in us that what we do have in store for us around the corner is what's best, and it's what's good, and it's guaranteed for you and I. Let me close with an illustration. How many of y'all have read or heard of the book series called The Chronicles of Narnia? Okay, so probably most of y'all have. My girls are reading this in school right now and kind of on their own as well. It's a great set of 7 little books. It's a kind of a fiction story about this different family and kind of this fairy tale land known as Narnia. But it was actually written by a guy named C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a professor at Oxford and Cambridge sometime back, and for the first half of his life, he was an atheist. Okay, he didn't believe in God. He was adamantly opposed to God. But over the course of C.S. Lewis's life, and he was an absolute genius as well. I mean, his IQ was absolutely off the chart. But over the course of his life, he began to kind of be in a little bit of conflict. Because the way that Lewis described it, he could not find his atheism to be consistent with what he saw in the world and what he understood about life. Okay? He said it was intellectually inconsistent to be an atheist and to see what he saw day in and day out. And so he said, well, for intellectual integrity, I cannot be an atheist any longer. Okay, and this began to have him explore. He's like, well, what is true then? If atheism isn't true, then what is it? Well, over the course of time, he became friends and got to know some people who were Christians, who were true followers of Christ. And in Lewis's own words, one of the things that he saw in them that he couldn't explain, he used this phrase. He said, I was surprised by joy. And what Lewis meant was this, is in people who really had a relationship with God and who were truly following Him wholeheartedly, he said they had a joy in them that was unexplainable. It was a joy that transcended their circumstances. It was a joy that transcended any of the pain, any of the challenges, any of the opportunities in life. And he said it was unexplainable except for the fact that they had God. And Lewis himself said, because I was so surprised by the joy, it caused me to look into the Scriptures and to see exactly who Jesus was. And he says, at that time, I realized that He was the only thing that made life make sense. Lewis became a Christian. He started growing in his faith, and that began to affect a lot of his writing, a lot of his teaching at Cambridge and Oxford over the remaining part of his life. This was the only children's book that he wrote. And throughout this book, again, it's kind of a fictional book, but Lewis began to kind of weave some truths of the Bible into the story. The main character in all of the books is actually a lion, and that lion was intended to represent Jesus himself and to help us get a picture of what the Bible teaches about Jesus when we understand this lion and how he operates and how he interacts with people. And I'm not going to tell you the whole thing about the story. I encourage you to read it. They're fun. They're easy reads. But I want you to go to the very last of the 7 books, the very last page in the entire series. When this book is being wrapped up, Lewis is trying to pull all of the books together, but he's also trying to teach us something about what's around the corner. He's trying to teach us something about what is in it for us, what God has in store for those who truly follow Him, who truly put Him in the driver's seat and allow Him to take our lives around the corner. And here's what Lewis says. He's talking about the lion. And he says, as the lion spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that, they were so great and beautiful, Lewis says, that I can't even write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they lived happily ever after. Now, what Lewis is saying is this. He says, listen, these people who really are following God, kind of the characters in the story who experienced the relationship with the lion, he says their lives, in the truest sense of the phrase happily ever after, they tasted it. They got it. Their lives experienced that joy that was insurmountable by anything that this world has to offer because of their relationship with God. So the rest of their lives, was happily ever after. Not in a fairy tale sense, but in a true sense. But then Lewis goes on, and this is how the book series ends. He says, so again, they lived happily ever after the rest of their lives here. And he says, but for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. You see, all of their life in this world and all of their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. But now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, and in which every chapter is better than the one before. You see, Lewis is describing the hope that God has for us. He's describing not what's just immediately around the corner, he's talking about what's ultimately around the corner. And he says this, you put Christ in the center of your life, you allow him to be kind of the captain of your ship, you put him in the driver's seat, then the rest of your life there is a joy that's insurmountable. And he says, but here's the thing, if your life is 30 years, 50 years, 80 years, 100 years, he said, here's what you also have to realize. He says, even that 30, 50, 80 years, he said, that's just the cover. And that's just the title page. He says, it's happily ever after, but he says, what we don't realize is the joy we experience there isn't even to the real story yet. He says the real story, the great story, happens after that. He says it's only after we turn the corner that we begin to enter into the great story that goes on forever, that no one on earth has ever read. And he says, you know what? Every chapter gets better and better and better. And I think that's a true metaphor for all that the Bible teaches us. And as we think about this reality, this metaphor for all of our lives, we're all asking that question, hey, what's around the corner? We have to remember, first of all, it's not about us. We're curious, what's in it for me? It's not about me. But everything that will take place around that corner, God wants to be involved in. He promises us He'll reshape our character. He'll reorient our relationships. He'll both protect us from pain and give us perspective through pain. He will connect our life to a bigger purpose, but He'll also give us hope, a confident expectation in what's to come. Because God promises each of you and myself tonight, if you'll trust Him, if you'll believe in Him, if you'll grow in Him, what's around the corner? It's happily ever after in the truest sense of the phrase. And even in this life, it's only the beginning. It's the title and it's the cover page. And for the rest of eternity, that's when the story really begins. No one's ever read it. It never ends. But each chapter will get better and better and better forever. That's the hope, not wishful thinking, but a confident reality of what's in it for us. And I just want to encourage each of you all in here, keep asking those questions. Keep experiencing what this looks like. The life that God promises us, it has no regrets. Okay? It's not going to promise us protection from all pain, but it's worth it. When you put Christ in the driver's seat of your life, He guarantees you'll never regret what's around the corner. Sound good? Hey, take a couple minutes just with people around you. Here's a few questions to consider, just discuss, and then we're going to kind of wrap up our evening here in a few minutes.